David Bowie's third studio album was originally released 50 years ago, on the 4th of November, 1970, in the United States, later released on the 10th of April, 1971, in the United Kingdom, and titled The Man Who Sold the World, a far cry from the preferred title of Metrobolist that Bowie had initially intended to release it under, a name now going to the 50th anniversary edition of the album released this year. The album was a commercial flop upon its release, selling only 1,395 copies in the US by the end of June 1971. With Bowie saying that it had, quote, sold like hotcakes in Beckenham and nowhere else, end quote. However, the album is a fascinating and enjoyable sign of things to come, with lyrics touching on themes of identity, mental illness, science fiction, and sexuality that would manifest in Bowie's later work, especially that of the Ziggy Stardust era, and a heavier, hard rock sound, marking a departure from the acoustic folk rock of his self-titled album released a year prior, with enough sci-fi tales, philosophical self-reflection, and social commentary to stand on its own. Like Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, a lot of the album functions as a sort of killing off of the past, and, as was the case with Scary Monsters, this means the album goes to some darker places that I have to provide a general content warning for right now, as well as more specific content warnings for each song. If you have not yet listened to The Man Who Sold the World, I'd advise you to do so, as I'd prefer you experience it on your own before I start explaining it. With all that being said, I think it's finally time to start analyzing. The first song on the album is an 8-minute-long epic, titled The Width of a Circle. While functioning perfectly fine as one holistic unit, it makes more sense to look at it as two separate songs, or two parts of the same song, as the first part of the song, written in late 1969, had no ending, petering out with a minute of improvisatory guitar after the song's second verse in the version recorded for the BBC on the 5th of February, 1970. So I cried for all the others till the day was nearly through, for I realized that God's a young man. The spontaneous boogie riff half of the song in the album version was added to the track by Tony Visconti and Mick Ronson during recording, leaving Bowie with the task of writing the two final verses of the song. The first half of the song is a series of mysterious and cryptic images hauntingly capturing the period of adolescence, the turn of the decade, or any period of change and transition, with Bowie saying in a 1971 interview with Zygote that the song, quote, covers a period from when I was about 17 to just before I recorded this album, end quote. Bowie expanded upon this in a 1972 interview with Phonograph Record, stating, quote, I used to have periods, weeks on end, when I just couldn't cope anymore. I'd slump into myself. I felt so depressed, and I really felt so aimless, and this torrential feeling of what's it all for anyway. A lot of it, the album, went through that period. Width of a Circle was definitely that. I went to the depths of myself in that. I tried to analogize the period of my life from when I left school to that time, to the making of that LP, just for my own benefit, not really for any listener's benefit. I very much doubt whether anyone could decipher that song correctly on my level, but a lot of people have deciphered it on their own levels. That's fine, that's what a song does. End quote. The first verse consists of confessions of being displeased with the narrow paths of life and religion set out for you. Descriptions of aging, and what David Buckley in Strange Fascination refers to as the, quote, Kafkaesque transmogrification, end quote, of the verse's final two lines. an echo of the line in Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which reads, quote, "He who fights with monsters might take care, lest he become a monster," end quote. This pattern of cryptic images continues in the second verse of the song, which starts with the continuation of the first verse's last two lines, in which the narrator has a confusing conversation with his doppelganger. Well, I said hello and I say hello, and they ask why not and I reply not below. Continues with the mysterious and mystifying symbol of a blackbird, laughing insane and quoting Lebanese-American poet and philosopher Khalil Gibran. So we asked the simple blackbird, who is happy as can be. Well, he laughed insane and quipped Khalil Gibran. Which Chris O'Leary, in his blog post about the song, says was used as a, quote, hip reference, end quote, due to the popularity of Gibran's works among the hippie counterculture of the 1960s, and ends with the narrator wasting the day away, crying for all the others, until his striking realization in the verse's final line that he might as well enjoy himself, for God is a young man too. And I cried for all the others till the day was nearly through, where I realized that God's a young man too. The third verse, being one of the ones Bowie wrote in the studio, serves as a transition between the cryptic images of the first part of the song and the sexual encounter of the second, in which the narrator's realization in the previous verse leads him to bidding farewell to his doppelganger, trading his mind. Said so long and a wave bye-bye, and I smashed my soul and traded my mind. And sexually experimenting, hooking up with a drowsy sex worker in a brothel. Got laid by a young bordello who was vaguely half asleep. An experience he is relatively uninterested in, and one which damages his reputation. For which my reputation swept back home in drag. The final lines of the verse introduce the subject matter of the song's second half, in which God takes his logic for a ride, and his sexual experimentation is brought to a whole different level. And the morals of his magic spell negotiate my hide, when God did take my logic for a ride. This second half starts after a 2-minute instrumental break, and in it, the narrator enjoys a sexual encounter with a supernatural being, often interpreted as being God or the devil. My money is on the latter, but that might be because I'm an Alexandre Cabanel fan. The narrator comes across this supernatural entity in the fourth verse, and is shown the leather belt round his hips, presumably for punishing sinners, in an instance of masochistic sexuality likely influenced by the Velvet Underground's Venus in Furs. He swallowed his pride and looked at his lips. They showed me the leather bound round his hips. My knees were shaking, my cheeks aflame. He said, "You'll never go down to the gods again." A punishment given a celestial edge in the following verse, when the being opens up a cavern and plunges both of them to the depths of hell. Struck the ground, the cavern appeared, and I smelled the burning pit of fear. Crashed 1,000 yards below. I said, do it again, do it again. The following two verses are filled with supernatural descriptions of pure sensual pleasure, or, as the song puts it, a venom high, a line that, along with the previous line about the snake and I, serves as a reference to the serpent of Genesis, interpreted to either be the devil in disguise or a symbol of temptation, as the narrator is ravished by the spitting century horned and tailed, and left gasping for more. His nebulous body swayed above, his tongue swollen with devil's love. A snake and high, a venom high. I said, do it again, do it again. Breathe, breathe, breathe deeply. And I was seething, breathing deeply. Spitting century horned and tailed, waiting for you. This bizarre sexual affair in the song's latter half may seem like a non sequitur, totally unrelated to the first half of the song, and most of Bowie's discography. And while it definitely is a few of those things, it begins to make a bit more sense when looked at closer. The scene paints a vastly different picture of religion than the small and yellow prayers of the first part of the song, using what John O'Connell refers to in Bowie's bookshelf as a, quote, concentration of emetic, Bosch-like images, end quote, inspired by Bowie's appreciation for Comte de Lautréamont's Les Chants de Maldoror and Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy, two works with an enormous influence on the movement of surrealism. Complementing this religious imagery of the song's latter part is the song's mystical, almost occultic title, originally meant to go to the George Underwood illustration on the back of the sleeve of his eponymous 1969 album, which ended up being mistakenly titled The Depth of the Circle. The circle being referred to is likely a reference to Dante's seventh circle of hell, the innermost ring of which was filled with blasphemers, usurers, and, most relevant to the song's lyrics, sodomites. But, as is pointed out in the song's page on BowieBible.com, the titular circle could also be the being's whip mentioned in the fourth verse, or other things. It should be noted that this fascination with more surreal and mystical religious texts as a dramatic statement of change prefigures Bowie's fascination with the occult, which snuck onto tracks like Hunky Dory's Quicksand and came out with full force on Station to Station. This religious imagery is combined with a sexual narrative that Buckley says is, quote, almost sacrilegious in its depiction of God and the devil in the throes of sexual desire, end quote, a combination artistically and sexually capturing the experimentation and radical shifts away from the societal norms of the straight and narrow paths of the song's opening one makes during adolescence. This notion is further enhanced by Bowie's drawn-out, occasionally intimate, pleasured chanting of a vocal, and by the fact that this song is the first of Bowie's to cover the topic of gay sex, foretelling the repertoire of homoeroticism to come in the lyrics of songs like The Bewley Brothers, Queen Bitch, He's a Goldmine, later renamed to Velvet Goldmine, John, I'm Only Dancing, and Boys Keep Swinging, to name a few. This unstable environment of constant change is captured by the song's instrumentals, especially the instrumental break between the two parts, in which the harder rock feel of much of the song's opening gives way to what O'Leary describes as the, quote, ominous sliding guitar riff, end quote, from the beginning of the song. Which gives way to the slower acoustic guitar with a bit of reverb, to which more instruments are slowly added. Which finally gives way to the spontaneous boogie riff of the song's final section. The bit from Richard Strauss's Also Spoke Zarathustra on the drums at the end of the song adds to the Nietzschean contents of some of the song's lyrics and tops off the song's exaggerated instrumentals. Accompanying the environment of mystical experimentation and radical change of the song's lyrics and instrumentals, and the queer nature of the song's latter half, is the UK cover art for the album, which features Bowie reclining in a chaise longue in the Haddon Hall living room, wearing a satin Mr. Fish dress, his flowing golden locks falling below his shoulders, a look Bowie said was inspired by the pre-Raphaelite paintings of Gabriel Rossetti. However, as Ian Chapman points out in Experiencing David Bowie, it's likely that the cover's imagery was also inspired by Rossetti's poem, The Card Dealer. Rossetti's titular femme fatale card dealer is very reminiscent of Bowie's appearance on the album. Her, quote, woven golden hair, end quote, and the description of the cards falling from the subject's hands to, quote, the bright board, end quote, of the floor, complementing Bowie's flowing golden locks and the album cover's similarly scattered cards. Chapman even goes as far to compare the color palettes of the two works, writing, quote, 3 of the 4 colors that Rossetti names in the poem, blood red and purple, green and blue, predominate in the cover. The red curtaining framing the upper left and right corners of the image, the purple and blue shiny silk/satin look of the material upon which Bowie lies, and the blue floral designs upon his dress, end quote. This cover was a visual accompaniment of Width of a Circle's lyrics of transition and experimentation, marking a shift towards Bowie's more androgynous appearance in the covers of Hunky Dory, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Aladdin Sane, Pin-Ups, Diamond Dogs, and Young Americans, and was a statement of change so radical that the cover was rejected by Mercury in the United States, where the album was released with the original Michael Weller cartoon design. Adding to this theme of transition, as well as the song's themes of identity, is the fact that this marks the first time Bowie portrayed a character other than himself on his album art. In the covers of his two previous studio albums, he presented as an albeit folksy version of himself. But in the cover for The Man Who Sold the World, the backdrop and his presentation convey the image of the pre-Raphaelite femme fatale archetype, prefiguring his presentation in later album covers as an alien rock star, human-dog hybrid, and, most similar to his femme fatale presentation on this cover, a parody of the 1940s silver screen leading lady. However, the back cover of the album, a black and white close-up of his similarly feminine Bowie smirking and wearing a different dress than the one on the front, makes it clear that it's not as simple as Bowie playing a character. As Chapman points out, the close-up nature of the rear cover strips Bowie's cross-dressing of its context as an art history parody, which, when combined with the shift from color to black and white, as well as Bowie's smirk, gives the impression that the cross-dressing is not a character, but the authentic Bowie. This interplay between the identities of Bowie's characters and Bowie the person, and its crossover with non-traditional gender presentation, once again hints at what would become the character of Ziggy Stardust. But Bowie's androgynous appearance isn't the cover art's only radical gesture symbolic of change, as the other, far more potent of these gestures, has to do with the cards scattered on the ground, evocative of various divination practices involving cards, a symbol which initially had a narrative to go along with it. Mike Weller, although it's likely this is a typo on the part of the blog post and the quote actually comes from photographer Keith McMillan, explained this narrative in the announcement for the album's 50th anniversary edition, which contains unused photos elaborating on the narrative, saying, quote, "There is a story concealed in the carpet-scattered playing cards. David has thrown a plain 52 card deck in the air as though casting the runes. But, in a significant break from 60s tarot divinations such as Yi Jing, etc., he casts runes using a four-suit pack, and he switches Mandress along with the court card of the future from right hand to left, signifying a new decade and new cultural era." End quote. After 8 minutes, punctuated by another 10 spent looking at the album cover wondering what it means and how you can tie it into your analysis of the song if you're anything like me, The Width of a Circle ends. The drum part from Also Spoke Zarathustra fades out before the next song begins. The second song on the album is called All the Madmen, and is about the institutionalization and mistreatment of mentally ill people, posing the question of whether a society guilty of such horrible practices can claim to be sane at all. The song is narrated by a patient at a psychiatric hospital who, in the first verse, describes how his friends are slowly being sent away.
Day after day, they send my friends away to mansions cold and grey, to the far side of town, where the thin men stalk the streets, while the sane stay underground.
Painting the world outside the hospital as a cold, bleak, and uncaring place where the streets are stalked by monstrous thin men. In the second verse, the narrator explains that while he is told that he can leave, he has no interest in doing so, as he is afraid that he won't fit in.
Day after day, they tell me I can go, they tell me I can blow to the far side of town, where it's pointless to be high, 'cause it's such a long way down.
Comparing integrating into the bleak, uncaring, sane society described in the first verse to the harsh feeling of coming down off of drugs. This sentiment is expanded upon in the song's pre-chorus, in which the narrator pretends to be mad so that he doesn't have to leave.
So I tell them that I can fly, I will scream, I will break my arm, I will do me harm. Here I stand, foot in hand, talking to
The fourth line of which is a reference to the Beatles' You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, an allusion capturing the derision and sense of shame the narrator feels he will face for his illness outside of the hospital. And in the song's chorus, in which the narrator exclaims that he'd rather stay with all the madmen in the hospital, because they're the only ones that understand how he feels. Underpinning this desire to be with people who understand you and accept you for who you are is a criticism of the state of psychiatry in the 1970s, and the way mental illnesses were treated, with lines referencing Librium, the brand name for chlordiazepoxide, a prescription drug used to treat alcohol withdrawal and anxiety, mixed with lines referencing electroconvulsive therapy. Don't set me free, I'm as heavy as can be, just my Librium and me, and my makes three. The narrator's libido splitting on him, often interpreted to be a hint at Bowie's bisexuality and a comment on the treatment of queer sexualities as mental illnesses, and lobotomy. My libido split on me, give me some good old lobotomy. Which is expanded upon in the third verse's description of the hospital staff taking some of the narrator's brain away, and trying to convince him that the cold, uncaring world he sees on the outside is the real way to live. Day after day, they take some brain away, then turn my face around to the far side of town, and tell me that it's real, then ask me how I feel. This commentary on the dehumanizing attitude towards people with mental illnesses is most overt in the song's bridge, in which Bowie asks,
where can the horizon lie, when a nation hides its organic minds in a cellar, dark and grim? They must be very dim.
The voices in the background of the bridge, one of a child asking if she can keep an animal that followed her home, the other of a scientist intelligibly pontificating on organic growth, help communicate this dehumanization, as well as the fear and paranoia of his illness, something further captured in the ending's meaningless chant of later reused on the Buddha of Suburbia, which is surrounded by unintelligible voices and the echoing clapping that the song ends on. While certain aspects of All the Madmen are outdated, the vocabulary used to describe mental illness and the view of people with illnesses like schizophrenia as a return to an organic mind, later cemented in Julian Jaynes's The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, rather than simply people suffering from an illness, other parts of it are just as relevant today as they were 50 years ago, such as its themes of wanting to stay with a community of people who understand you because they share your experiences, and its One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest style empathy for those with mental illnesses, and concern for how they're being treated, influenced by both the writings of R.D. Laing, especially his 1960 book The Divided Self, and by Bowie's close proximity with mental illness. Mental illness ran in Bowie's family. 3 of his aunts were all afflicted to some degree, one of whom was lobotomized, and another died in her late 30s after being institutionalized and undergoing electroshock therapy, and his half-brother, Terry Burns, suffered from schizophrenia. Terry returned from army service in 1958 increasingly disturbed, and, while walking home with Bowie after a Cream concert in the late 60s, gripped the tarmac while frantically claiming that he could see cracks in the road with flames coming out of them. By the time of The Man Who Sold the World, Burns was spending much of his time at Cane Hill Psychiatric Hospital, which appears in the illustration for the album's US cover by Mike Weller, who had a friend who was committed there. In an interview with Phonograph Record, Bowie admitted that the song was about Burns, stating, quote, "All the Madmen was written for my brother, and it's about my brother. He's the man inside, and he doesn't want to leave. He's perfectly happy there. Perfectly happy. Doesn't have to work, just lies there on the lawn all day, looking at the sky. He's very happy." End quote. Making the song the first of Bowie's songs to be directly inspired by Burns, with later songs including The Bewley Brothers, Aladdin Sane 1913 to 1938 to 1970, and Jump They Say. This sympathy for the experience of people suffering from mental illness is reflected in the song's instrumentals, which start out with nothing but an acoustic guitar, slowly adding cymbals and a recorder that create an atmosphere of what Buckley refers to as a, quote, childlike dementia, like a 7-year-old's first music lesson turned evil, end quote.
Day after day, they tell me I can go. They tell me I can blow to the far side of town, where it's pointless to be high.
This is added to by Bowie's vocals, which slowly build in strength until the song's final part, combining with the song's distorted harder rock instrumentals and the surrealist chant of the lyrics to create the chaotic, disturbed breakdown of the song's conclusion. It is this breakdown that the song ends on, slowly fading out before the next song on the album begins.
Pack a pack horse up and rest up here on Black Country Rock. You never know, you might find it here on Black Country Rock. Pack a pack horse up and rest up here on Black Country Rock. You never know, you might find it here on Black Country Rock.
The third song on the album is titled Black Country Rock, and, while serving as a fine vehicle for Ronson's electric guitar work, lyrically speaking, the song is, as O'Leary points out, quote, straight-up album filler, end quote. Like the second half of The Width of a Circle, the song originated from an in-studio jam session between Ronson and Visconti, and was given the working title of Black Country Rock because of its resemblance to the music of The Move, who were from an area in England's West Midlands, known as the Black Country because of its ties to coal mining and the Industrial Revolution. Bowie was then tasked with writing lyrics for the song, which he based on the title, explaining why the lyrics are some of his simplest. Reading what I can from the lyrics, the first verse mentions the titular Black Country Rock as a geographic location and the use of pack horses.
Pack a pack horse up and rest up here on Black Country Rock. You never know, you might find it here on Black Country Rock.
Establishing either a Western setting, if one reads it through the lens of the John Wayne-inspired cowboy on the US cover of the album, or a fantasy setting, if one reads it through the T-Rex influence on the song. The song's other verse verges on poetic in its vagueness, describing how the view from the titular Black Country Rock is often seen as beautiful, but might be too much for whomever Bowie is addressing.
Some say the view is crazy, but you may adopt another point of view. So if it's much too hazy, you can leave my friend and me with point of view.
Which John Mendelsohn, in his review of the album, points out accidentally supplies a meta and, quote, most cogent critique of his own recent work, end quote. More fascinating are the song's vocals, in which Bowie mimics the singing style of friend-slash-rival Mark Bolan of T-Rex, which he initially did as a joke, but ended up sticking. Bowie's imitation of Bolan's vibrato and vocalizations are especially present in the song's final verse, enhanced by Visconti's thinning of Bowie's vocals with an equalizer.
Some say the view is crazy, but you may adopt another point of view. So if it's much too hazy, you can leave my friend and me with point of view.
Strange beast from the legendless I can master with the aid of this skull-powdered cord. When the great outburst falls, she'll be queen of your hearts. Ha, ha, ha. Ha, ha, ha.
Bowie's impersonation of Bolan showcases their friendship/rivalry, which would only grow when T-Rex ushered in the age of glam rock with their performance of Hot Love on Top of the Pops 5 months after the album was released. Though Bowie's performance as Rainbow Man earlier in the year with his backing band Hype predates it by over a year. The upbeat, funky blues-style instrumentals of the song slowly fade out, and the next song begins.
But they think that we're holding a secretive ball. Want someone invite them, they're just taller children. That's all. After all.
The next song on the album is titled After All, and is a melancholic reflection on aging and existence. The first verse starts with a warning to reveal the truth of the song gently because they, likely referring to the older generation, won't take it too well, acknowledging that we all suffer from the same flaw.
Please trip them gently, they don't like to fall. Oh, by jingo. There's no room for anger, we're all very small.
The first verse then goes on to describe the younger generation's search for meaning and identity in a mystical language that almost predicts the creation of Ziggy Stardust.
We're painting our faces and dressing in thoughts from the skies, from paradise.
Which gets misinterpreted by the older generations as a Neverland-style exclusive club for the young, like that of Bowie's earlier There Is a Happy Land.
But they think that we're holding a secretive ball.
Before offering them an invitation, or as Visconti describes it, quote, a hand held out to the older generation that didn't quite understand or approve of what we youngsters were on about, end quote. Recognizing that adults are just taller children and should know what we know.
Want someone invite them, they're just taller children. That's all. After all.
The second verse starts with a description of how attachments like people lead to disappointment and should be let go.
Man is an obstacle, sad as the cloud. So hold on to nothing, and he won't let you down.
With hints of Nietzsche's idea that humanity is something to be surpassed, and of the Buddhist idea of the Tathagata, or one who has achieved enlightenment and transcended the coming and going of ordinary existence. This coming and going of ordinary existence is portrayed in the latter half of the verse, with its parallel descriptions of everyone marching towards death.
Some people are marching together, and some on their own, quite alone. Others are running, the smaller ones crawl.
And the mysterious figure at the end, sitting in silence, who could be anyone from a philosopher to a monk to a wise elderly person.
But some sit in silence, they're just older children. That's all. After all.
In the third verse, Bowie admits that, although he sings with impertinence, he doesn't have any of the answers either, recognizing that the song itself is as impermanent as the attachments of life, and apologizing for wasting the listener's time.
I sing with impertinence, shading impermanent chords with my words. I borrowed your time, and I'm sorry I called. But the thought just occurred, we're nobody's children at all. After all.
The idea that we're nobody's children and belong to nobody shows up in the first line of the final verse.
Live till your rebirth and do what you will.
Which returns to Buddhism in the idea of rebirth, and echoes occultist Aleister Crowley's maxim of do what thou wilt, before he once again apologizes for wasting the listener's time.
Forget all I've said, please spare me no will.
The song's chilling refrain of
I'll
complements the song's eclectic atmosphere of mysticism and philosophy, as the phrase "by Jingo" dates back to the 17th century as a substitute for "by Jesus." Additionally, it also references a 1919 novelty song of Tin Pan Alley, the innocence of which is twisted to something sinister with the song's melancholic, carnival-style waltz instrumental that evokes a sickly sense of nostalgia, adding to the lyrics' existentialism and meditation on aging. This is advanced by Bowie's vocals on the track, which are his most restrained on the album, verging on near whispers at times. This eerie combination of vocals and instrumentals makes the song, as O'Leary wrote, quote, "a requiem for the defeated," end quote, adding to the chilling existentialism of its lyrics, as well as Visconti put it, quote, "a song of gentle persuasion," end quote, and seductive sonic beauty that helps build its message to the older generation. The song's near whisper of a final line fades out before the next song begins.
I slashed them cold, I killed them dead, I broke the gooks, I cracked their heads, I bumped them out from under their beds, but now I've got the running gun blues.
The next song on the album is titled Running Gun Blues, and being a critique of the Vietnam War, it's the most straightforward song on the album. The song is narrated by a maniacal and murderous soldier who describes his killing spree in the song's first verse.
I count the corpses on my left, I find I'm not so tidy, so I better get away, better make it today. I've cut 23 down since Friday, but I can't control it. My face is drawn, my instinct still emotes it.
Which makes reference to the use of enemy body count as a measure of success during the war. In the song's chorus, the narrator describes the brutalities he committed during the war with glee, using dehumanizing and racist language to describe the Vietnamese people he killed.
I slashed them cold, I killed them dead, I broke the gooks, I cracked their heads, I bumped them out from under their beds, but now I've got the running gun blues.
Satirizing the jingoistic gung-ho mentality of the war, also critiqued in the John Wayne-inspired cowboy with the exploding head holding a rifle on the US cover of the album. In the third verse, the narrator describes how, although the war has been stopped by the opposition back home,
it seems the peaceful stopped the war, left generals squashed and stifled.
his killings have continued because the presence of soldiers is inherently dangerous, and the military and government haven't done anything to stop it.
But I'll slip out again tonight, 'cause they haven't taken back my rifle. For I promote oblivion, and I'll plug a few civilians.
This continuation of his killing, even after the war has ended, is addressed in the second instance of the song's chorus, which switches from the past tense to the future tense.
I'll slash them cold, I'll kill them dead, I'll break the boots, I'll crack their heads, I'll slice them till they're running red, but now I've got the running gun blues.
It could be pointed out that this portrayal of a soldier in Vietnam as a psychotic mass murderer plays into the demonization of Vietnam veterans as deranged baby killers at the time, a demonization that I disagree with considering the amount of soldiers who were drafted in. However, I think the song is using its main character as a sort of symbol to point out how the US military promotes this dehumanization and murder, covering up war crimes such as the My Lai massacre of early 1968, which wouldn't become public knowledge until 5 months before recording on the album began. Even this ghoulish, inhuman serial killer is still given an edge of sympathy, as he mentions that he suffers from the titular run-and-gun blues in the last line of the song's chorus.
But now I've got the running gun blues.
Likely a reference to post-traumatic stress disorder. This reference gives the track's lyrics a new dimension, suggesting that the narrator may have experienced something traumatic and developed a mental illness, ignored by his superiors, that reduced him to the serial killer he is when the song takes place, mirroring the concern for the mentally ill present in all the Madmen, perhaps influenced by Burns' increasingly erratic behavior after returning from his tour in the RAF. The lyrics' critique of the jingoistic, gung-ho mentality of the war is present in the song's instrumentals, which start off almost entirely acoustic, save for the ominous drums at the very beginning. But quickly build to the over-the-top hard rock sound, again including Ronson's impressive electric guitar work, that starts in the first chorus and maintains itself for most of the track, mirroring how Bowie's vocals build to the exaggerated glee for murder of the first chorus.
I can't control it. My face is drawn, my instinct still emotes it. I slashed them cold, I killed them dead, I broke the goose, I cracked their heads.
The song's ending further adds to this satiristic, over-the-top celebration of war, as Visconti says that it is, quote, a sort of play on the overture of 1812, with cannon fire generated by the Moog synthesizer, end quote. This ending slowly fades out before the next song on the album begins.
Don't let me stay, don't let me stay. My logic says burn, so send me away. Your minds are too green, I despise all I've seen. You can't stake your lives on a Saviour Machine.
The next song on the album is titled Saviour Machine, and is a science fiction story, exhibiting the fact that Bowie had far from worn out his penchant for rock sci-fi with his earlier Space Oddity, in which humanity develops a supercomputer to solve all of the world's problems, only for it to go horribly wrong. The beginning of the first verse recounts how this Saviour Machine came into being, with it being proposed by a political figure as a solution to all of the world's problems.
President Joe once had a dream. The world held his hand, gave their pledge, so he told them his scheme for a Saviour Machine.
The machine is then named the Prayer, bestowing a deific status upon it, seemingly backed up by the machine's ability to instantaneously bring an end to war and famine.
They called it the prayer, its answer was law. Its logic stopped war, gave them food, how they adored, till it cried in its boredom.
However, as is the case with most superintelligent AI, its programming soon leads to a paradox. The machine was programmed with the sole purpose of solving all of humanity's problems, and, having ended all of their problems, save for their over-reliance on the machine, it grows bored and questions its purpose, creating problems of its own for humanity and pleading to be shut off.
Please don't believe in me. Please disagree with me. Life is too easy. A plague seems quite feasible now. Or maybe a war, I may kill you all.
In the song's bridge, the machine once again describes its power and omnipotence.
I need you flying, and I'll show that dying is living beyond reason. Sacred dimension of time. I can steal every sign. I can steal every mind.
Building off of the ideas of a being beyond humanity and after all. In the song's chorus, the machine once again pleads for its termination.
Don't let me stay. Don't let me stay. My logic says burn, so send me away.
Criticizing humanity for its naivete in thinking that a machine can solve all of their problems.
Your minds are too green. I despise all I've seen. You can't stake your lives on a Saviour Machine.
The song explores the idea of a hyper-intelligent, possibly sentient supercomputer that was incredibly popular at the time, appearing in science fiction films, novels, and short stories such as I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, The God Machine, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stand on Zanzibar, and Colossus, The Forbin Project, which explored the increasing technological anxiety and future shock that comes with the advance of a new technological age. The song's idea of a machine being worshipped as a god also owes a lot to the much earlier Metropolis, which inspired the album's intended title of Metropolist. All of these ideas give a sci-fi edge to the apocalypse of Bowie's earlier songs, such as We Are Hungry Men and Signet Committee, pioneering the combination of sci-fi and dystopia that would later be perfected in Ziggy Stardust and Diamond Dogs. This sci-fi dystopia is enhanced by what O'Leary describes as Bowie's, quote, eerie seesawing vocal, end quote, and the song's instrumentals, which combine complex time changes, impressive displays of the Moog synthesizer emulating symphonic instruments, and Ronson's incredibly manic guitar solos. Ronson's solo and the rest of the song's outro fade out before the next song begins. The next song on the album is titled She Shook Me Cold, and is incredibly cryptic and mysterious. No one knows what that line could possibly be about. I'm being coy and I apologize. She Shook Me Cold is very clearly a song about sex, with its double entendre-laden first verse describing the ecstasy of a sexual rendezvous. This ecstasy initially challenges and frightens the narrator, who suddenly takes leave. In the third verse, it is revealed that this is because, in all of his previous relationships, the narrator used and then left his partners.
I was very smart, broke the gentle hearts of many young virgins. I was quick on the ball, left them so lonely they just could not try.
But realizes that he has met his match and that he needs her.
Then she took my head, smashed it off, get my young blood rising. Crushed me mercilessly, kept it going around, so she don't know I'm great for her soul.
This reaches its peak, pun unintended, in the song's final verse, which sees the narrator yearn to experience that ecstasy again before reusing a lot of earlier lines. The lyrics' focus on lust and sex is a far cry from both the folky romanticism of most of Bowie's earlier songs. Save for Width of a Circle earlier on the album, the song was Bowie's most sexual since the relatively tame Let Me Sleep Beside You, and what Buckley refers to as the, quote, cozy, cliched, heterosexualized monogamy peddled by the pure pop tunesmiths of the 60s, end quote, foretelling the focus on sexuality of Ziggy Stardust. Adding to this newfound focus on sexuality are Bowie's drawn-out vocals, culminating in a verse of moaning following the second verse. And the song's straight-up heavy metal instrumentals, with a minute-long instrumental break displaying Ronson's impassioned lead guitar, as well as Woody Woodmansey's intense drums and Visconti's similarly impressive bass guitar work. The song abruptly stops after Bowie's drawn-out vocal in the song's final verse ends, and the next song begins. The next song on the album is the title track, The Man Who Sold the World. The song uses the idea of having a conversation with one's doppelganger, or a past version of oneself, from width of a circle, as a haunting exploration of duality and identity, with Bowie saying of it in a 1997 interview with BBC Radio 1,
that song for me always sort of exemplified kind of how you feel when you're young, where you know there's a piece of yourself that you haven't really put together yet. And you have this great searching, this great need to find out who you really are.
In the first verse, the narrator meets their past self on a stairway, in a haunting piece of imagery inspired by William Hughes Mearns' Antigonish.
We passed up on the stair. We spoke of was and when.
The past version of the narrator refers to them as a friend, which they take as a surprise because they thought they had put that part of themselves behind them and let it die.
Although I wasn't there, he said I was his friend, which came as some surprise. I spoke into his eyes, I thought you died alone, a long, long time ago.
In the first chorus, this past self reveals that he never left, and admits to being the titular man who sold the world.
I know, not me. I never lost control. Your face took place with the man who sold the world.
This moniker is one that has had many interpretations, being seen as a reference to various similarly titled sci-fi stories, a description of how the narrator's past self gave their life to the narrator, or a representation of how the narrator's doppelganger committed some act of deception. Whatever the case, the narrator laughs at the discovery that his former self is still alive, shaking his hand before attempting to move on.
I laughed and shook his hand and made my way back home.
However, this revelation spurs some serious self-reflection in the narrator, who is left looking to other people in a search for meaning and that long-lost part of himself.
I searched for form and land. For years and years I roamed.
Only to realize that everyone else is on the same search for that part of themselves, and are just as lost as he is.
I gazed a gazeless stare at all the millions here. We must have died alone a long, long time ago.
In the final version of the chorus, the line switches from I to we, suggesting a conclusion to the narrator's search for the lost part of himself, and a blending of identity.
Who knows? Not me. We never lost control. Your face to face with the man who sold the world.
The Man Who Sold the World blends eerie ghost poems, science fiction titles, and concepts and themes from earlier songs on the album, to create a chilling reflection on adolescence and the duality of identity that would remain a standout for Bowie's career. While Bowie would say in a 1993 interview with Simon Bates,
There is a philosopher whose name I wish I could remember, who said that one creates the doppelganger so that you can inflict one's own fears and guilts and passions and the darker sides of one's personality onto that doppelganger, and then you kill him and hope by doing that you no longer retain those weaknesses and faults yourself. I feel that's probably played not a small part in my life. The idea of the doppelganger as being somebody that I can affix my own fears and paranoias on.
This song seems to be suggesting the opposite, that, no matter how hard one tries, that doppelganger will never die off, remaining a part of one's identity whether or not they know it. The song's haunting atmosphere of self-reflection is enhanced by Bowie's vocals, with Mendelssohn commending how Visconti's, quote, use of echo, phasing, and other techniques on Bowie's voice to achieve a weird and supernatural tone reminiscent of a robot, which is to imply not that Bowie sings mechanically, but that his voice is oddly metallic to begin with, serves to reinforce the jaggedness of Bowie's words and music, end quote. And Buckley pointing out that Bowie, quote, intones each line as if reciting the Lord's Prayer or some other holy text, end quote.
We passed up on the stair. We spoke of was and when.
The song's instrumentals also add to this, with the organ, synthesizers, güiro, and wordless vocals at the end of the track building a dreamlike atmosphere, and Mick Ronson's main riff, which is almost eerie in its simplicity, staying the same throughout the song but shifting keys as the surrounding music shifts alongside it, matching the lyrics' reflection on the duality of identity.
Shook his hand and made my way back home.
The song's chilling, dreamlike atmosphere and meditation on identity has attracted a few other artists to it, and it's amassed its fair share of cover versions over the years. There are two particular covers of this song that I think do something interesting with it that I want to talk about. The first of these is Midge-Ure's 1982 cover of the song, which heavily expands upon the synthesizers and slightly metallic vocals of Bowie's original.
Stair. We spoke of was and when, although I wasn't there. He said I was his friend, which came as some surprise. I spoke into his eyes. I thought you died alone a long, long time.
Ure's vocals are much more distorted than Bowie's, which, when combined with the darker, synthesizer-heavy instrumentals, gives off the feeling that his voice is trapped behind the synthesizers, making the song a gloomy electronic lament, a ghostly counterpart to Bowie's original. The other version of the song I want to discuss, and the one I'm sure you thought of as soon as I brought up cover versions of the song, is Nirvana's 1993 performance of the song on MTV Unplugged. In typical Unplugged fashion, the track was pared down to its bass components and played entirely acoustic, save for the hidden fuzzbox Cobain's guitar was fed through. The instrumentals on the track are of such a quality that they almost make me believe in perfection, and Cobain's vocal performance gives the cover a grittier, unrefined, more personalized feel.
Oh no. Not me. We never lost control. The face to face of the man who sold the world.
Nirvana's cover of the song is of such a quality that it's no wonder their performance of it popularized the song. The song's ghostly outro fades out, leading into the final song on the album.
When all the world was very young, and mountain magic a heavy hung, the Supermen would walk in file, guardians of the loveless isle, and gloomy browed with super fear, their tragic endless lives could heave nor sigh in solemn perverse serenity, wondrous beings chained to life.
The final song on the album is titled The Supermen, and is a take on Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or overhuman, although the most well-known translation is Superman, with Bowie saying in a 1976 interview with BBC Radio 1, quote, "I was still going through the thing when I was pretending I understood Nietzsche, and I had tried to translate it into my own terms to understand it, so Supermen came out of that," end quote. While Nietzsche's Übermensch was something humanity should strive to achieve, Bowie's Supermen are a long-gone race of mythological godlike entities, blending Nietzsche's original concept with adjacent concepts, such as H.P. Lovecraft's Elder Gods or the superhuman mutants popular in the science fiction and comics of the mid-20th century. The beginning of the first verse of the song introduces this immortal race of Elder Gods, setting them in a long-ago age ruled by magic.
When all the world was very young, and mountain magic a heavy hung, the Supermen would walk in file, guardians of the loveless isle.
In the second half of the first verse, it is revealed that their suffering transcends that of ordinary humans, their immortality chaining them to a life filled with nothing but fear beyond human comprehension, and a grim, sickening sense of serenity.
And gloomy browed with super fear, their tragic endless lives could heave nor sigh in solemn perverse serenity, wondrous beings chained to life.
The descriptions of the horror of the Supermen's immortality continue in this first chorus, which describes how their inability to die makes life into one tragic, monotonous blur that, because of their transcendence of humanity, can only be mourned with a whimper. The song's second verse begins by establishing the Supermen's immense power and transcendence of humanity, mixing sci-fi descriptions of minds in uni thought with fantasy descriptions of mystical powers.
Where all were minds in uni thought, powers weird by mystics taught, no pain, no joy, no power to write, colossal strength, the grasp of fate.
All punctuated by the Supermen's immense power and lack of emotions. In the latter part of the verse, the Supermen suffer from nightmares filled with ominous Boschian imagery like that of the width of a circle, the only escape from which is succumbing to mortality.
Nightmare men tossed in slumbers, nightmare dreams no mortal mind could hold. Man would tear his brother's flesh, a chance to die, a turn to mold.
The Supermen do just that in the final chorus, which starts with ominous imagery of red skies and teary eyes, the final line of which replaces cries with dies, releasing the Supermen from their nightmarish immortality into the bliss of death. The Supermen is a fascinating philosophical exploration of Nietzsche's overhuman, and one that would pave the way for the concept's re-exploration in the Homo Superior of Oh You Pretty Things, and the alien infinites of the loose story surrounding Ziggy Stardust. The song's exaggerated, over-the-top instrumentals add to the all-powerful feeling of the Supermen, with Mick Ronson's powerful guitar riff given to Bowie by Jimmy Page in 1965, and Woody Woodmansey's performance on the timpani serving as a reference to the German Romanticism of Richard Strauss, whose Also Sprach Zarathustra made an appearance at the end of Width of a Circle. Creating an atmosphere of deific power and triumph. As Buckley points out, the song consists of, quote, towering spirals of sound, end quote, and, quote, is deliberately monumental, primal, and triumphalist, end quote. This triumphalism is added to by Bowie's heavily exaggerated vocals.
Colossal strength, the grasp of fate, where sad-eyed mermen tossed in slumbers. Nightmare dreams no mortal mind could hold. A man would tear his brother's flesh, a chance to die, a turn to mold.
The celebratory nature of which, when combined with the hellish imagery of the song, produces a chilling, sinister effect, with Bowie going as far as saying that the song is, quote, pre-fascist, end quote, in that 1976 interview. The song's exaggerated instrumentals fade out as the Supermen are released into death, and the album ends. Tony Visconti once said that, of the 11 studio albums he produced or co-produced for Bowie, his two favorites were Scary Monsters and The Man Who Sold the World. The first, being one of Bowie's most celebrated albums, immediately makes sense, but at first glance, the inclusion of an album as obscure and commercially unsuccessful as The Man Who Sold the World might raise a few eyebrows. However, on closer inspection, The Man Who Sold the World has a lot in common with Scary Monsters. The album, both lyrically and musically, serves as a gritty transition into the new decade. The lyrics of the individual songs, much like Scary Monsters, are filled with bleak visions of occultism, mistreatment of the mentally ill, serial killers, malfunctioning supercomputers, sex maniacs, and philosophical ponderings of the duality of human identity and the horrors of immortality, which serve both as signs of what's to come and as killer songs in their own right. It's this interesting philosophy, sci-fi, and social commentary of the album's lyrics, the album's impressive hard rock sound, and its fascinating place in Bowie's discography that make the album so captivating. As Visconti said in his interview with Buckley, it was, quote, a primer for generations to come, end quote. Hi there, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of The Man Who Sold the World. I took a lot longer on this one than I usually do, so I hope it paid off. I had initially planned to get this out much earlier, on the 50th anniversary of the album's release in America back in November, but for a variety of reasons, both personal and technology related, that didn't end up happening. And then the backup plans to get it out in early January, and then on the album's UK release date back in April, they both fell through as well. So I'm releasing it right now. I have a couple more projects planned for this year, and hopefully those won't take as long as this one did, before I go on a hiatus to work on a few larger things that I have planned as well. Before I end the video, though, I want to take a brief moment to celebrate the fact that between the date of my last upload and this one right now, my channel has reached not only 100 subscribers, but 600 subscribers. And this is truly amazing. This is incredible. And I want to thank all of those who are subscribed to my channel. If you aren't subscribed already, I would encourage you to do so, or at least like the video, because it really helps. As always, links to my script and my sources are available in the description below, and the art I produced for the video is up on my Pinterest. Bye! Oh my god. Okay. I just spilled water.